Imagine standing in a silent palace long before sunrise. The corridors are still. Candles burn low, their light trembling against polished walls covered in gold. Servants whisper as they hurry across stone floors, careful not to disturb the silence. Somewhere beyond the windows, the gardens disappear into the darkness, waiting for the first hint of dawn. Then, almost as if the entire kingdom has been holding its breath, a single door opens. A young king begins his day. Hundreds of eyes follow him. Every movement matters. Every word may shape the future of Europe. He is remembered as the Sun King, the ruler who claimed that all light flowed outward from his throne. Yet behind the dazzling image was a child who grew up surrounded by fear, uncertainty, and betrayal. Before he built one of the most magnificent palaces the world had ever seen, he learned what it felt like to flee his own capital in the middle of the night. Before he became the symbol of absolute power, he discovered how fragile power could truly be. And that hidden beginning changes everything we think we know about Louis XIV. Welcome once again to another slow journey through the past. If these quiet walks through history help you unwind at the end of the day, consider leaving a like and subscribing so you can join us for future adventures through forgotten kingdoms and remarkable lives. If you feel like sharing, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. There is something comforting about imagining people in distant cities, under different skies, settling into the very same story. Now, make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Let the day's noise drift away. Tonight, we are traveling to 17th century France, into a world of kings, queens, grand cathedrals, crowded marketplaces, ambitious nobles, and one extraordinary ruler whose life would reshape Europe for generations. To understand Louis XIV, we cannot begin with Versailles. We cannot begin with dazzling court ceremonies or glittering halls filled with mirrors. Instead, we must begin with a country that seemed powerful on the outside but uncertain beneath the surface. France in the early 17th century was already one of Europe's largest kingdoms. Its fertile fields stretched across rolling countryside, producing grain, grapes, and countless other crops that fed millions of people. Rivers such as the Loire, the Seine, and the Rhône connected towns and cities, carrying merchants, travelers, and news from one province to another. Forests covered vast regions. Small villages rested beneath church towers that marked the rhythm of daily life with the ringing of bells. Yet France was not the perfectly united kingdom it might appear on a map. Roads were often muddy and slow. Each province had its own traditions and privileges. Local nobles guarded their authority. Taxes varied from place to place. Some people enjoyed exemptions while others carried heavy burdens. Communication between distant regions could take weeks. Life for ordinary families followed the seasons. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their fields. Bakers prepared bread while streets were still dark. Fishermen worked rivers and coastal waters. Blacksmiths filled village air with the ringing of hammers striking hot iron. Children learned family trades from an early age. Disease remained common, and a poor harvest could mean hunger for thousands. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence. Churches stood at the center of communities, not only as places of worship but as gathering places where news spread and important events were announced. Festivals marked the passing year, while faith offered comfort during uncertain times. Above this world stood the monarchy. The king was believed to rule by divine right, meaning that his authority ultimately came from God. This belief did not simply make the king politically powerful. It surrounded him with sacred meaning. To challenge the king could be seen as challenging the natural order itself. But beliefs are one thing. Reality is often another. By the time our story begins, France had experienced decades of religious conflict, political rivalries, and struggles among powerful noble families. Although peace had returned in many places, memories of violence remained fresh. Trust between rulers and subjects had not fully healed. Meanwhile, across Europe, great powers watched one another with constant suspicion. Spain remained wealthy from its overseas empire, though cracks had begun to appear beneath its strength. The Holy Roman Empire stretched across Central Europe as a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities. England faced its own political storms. The Dutch Republic thrived through commerce and naval power. Everywhere, rulers sought advantage, forming alliances that could disappear almost overnight. France stood at the center of this complicated world. And this is where another remarkable figure quietly enters our story. Long before Louis XIV ruled alone, another man had been shaping France from behind the scenes. His name was Cardinal Richelieu. Although remembered as a churchman, Richelieu was also one of history's most skilled political strategists. Serving under King Louis XIII, he believed that the monarchy must become stronger than the great nobles who often challenged royal authority. Through careful diplomacy, intelligence networks, military reforms, and political determination, he slowly increased the power of the crown. Many admired him. Others feared him. When Richelieu died in 1642, he left behind a stronger monarchy, but also one that depended heavily on capable ministers. Only months later, King Louis XIII himself died. The throne now belonged to a child. On September 5, 1638, Louis de Udon, later known as Louis XIV, had been born after many years during which his parents believed they might never have an heir. His birth was celebrated across France. Some people called him a gift from God. Church bells rang. Public celebrations filled cities. Hope spread throughout the kingdom. Few could have imagined how long he would eventually reign. But in 1643, when his father died, Louis was only 4 years old. A 4-year-old could wear a crown. He could not govern a kingdom. Responsibility therefore passed to his mother, Anne of Austria, who became regent. Despite her name, Anne was actually a Spanish princess from the powerful Habsburg dynasty before becoming Queen of France through marriage. Many underestimated her. That would prove to be a mistake. Anne chose Cardinal Jules Mazarin as her chief minister. Mazarin had learned much from Richelieu and continued many of his policies. Intelligent, patient, and highly diplomatic, he worked tirelessly to preserve royal authority while guiding the young king through dangerous years. Yet governing France was becoming increasingly difficult. Wars drained the treasury. Taxes remained high. Noble families disliked losing influence. Judges in important courts questioned royal decisions. Ordinary people struggled under financial pressure. Across the kingdom, frustration slowly accumulated like dark clouds before a storm. Young Louis observed all of this. Children notice more than adults sometimes realize. He watched meetings filled with tension. He saw worried expressions among advisors. He heard conversations stop when he entered a room. He learned that smiles at court did not always mean friendship. The palace itself could appear magnificent, yet beneath the polished floors lay endless competition. Courtiers sought favors. Officials protected their own interests. Every appointment, every marriage, every alliance carried political meaning. Even as a child, Louis lived inside this complicated web. His education reflected the expectations placed upon a future king. Tutors instructed him in history, languages, religion, military matters, dancing, writing, music, and etiquette. Dancing, surprisingly to modern ears, was considered an essential royal skill. Court ballet displayed discipline, grace, and authority. Louis excelled at it. Years later, his performances as the son in elaborate court ballets would inspire the famous title by which history remembers him, the Sun King. But that glorious image belonged to the future. For now, uncertainty surrounded everything. The year 1648 brought new trouble. The government needed money to continue its wars. Financial demands increased. Members of the Parliament of Paris, one of the kingdom's highest judicial bodies, resisted certain royal policies. Disagreements deepened into open conflict. Soon protests spread. Barricades appeared in Paris. Crowds filled narrow streets. The city became restless. This period became known as the Fronde, a series of civil conflicts that lasted several years and involved nobles, judges, city leaders, and ordinary citizens with differing goals. Not everyone fought for the same reasons. Some sought political reform. Others wanted greater personal influence. Some simply opposed heavy taxation. History has a habit of simplifying such events. The reality was far more complicated. For the young king, however, complexity mattered less than experience. One night, danger came uncomfortably close. Fearing unrest in Paris, and of Austria, and her advisors decided that the royal family must leave the city quickly. Under cover of darkness, the child king departed with little ceremony. Imagine the scene. Cold night air. Horse hooves striking wet streets. Carriages moving quietly through sleeping neighborhoods. The future ruler of France leaving his own capital because it was no longer safe. Moments like these leave lasting marks. Louis never forgot the feeling of vulnerability. He never forgot seeing angry crowds capable of threatening royal authority. He never forgot that even kings could be forced to run. What happened during those years would shape almost every major decision he made as an adult. But the full consequences were still hidden. For now, France remained trapped in uncertainty, and the boy who would one day build Versailles was learning the first hard lesson of power, that the brightest crowns often cast the darkest shadows. And as the kingdom struggled through rebellion and fear, something quietly changed inside the young Louis. He began to understand that if he ever truly ruled, he would never again allow the monarchy to appear weak before its own people. That quiet promise, born in childhood and strengthened by fear, would eventually transform France, astonish Europe, and create one of the most unforgettable reigns in history. But before the Sun King could rise, the long night of his youth still had many chapters left to unfold. The memory of that hurried escape from Paris never truly faded. Years later, when Louis XIV looked out across the endless gardens of Versailles, watching fountains shimmer beneath the afternoon sun and nobles compete for the smallest gesture of his attention, he may have remembered another kind of journey. Not one of triumph, but one of fear. A frightened child carried away from his own capital in the darkness, uncertain whether the crown on his head could truly protect him. It is often said that our greatest ambitions grow from our deepest anxieties. Whether Louis himself would have agreed is impossible to know. But history suggests that the lessons of his childhood became the foundation of the kingdom he later built. For several years after the outbreak of the Fronde, France seemed trapped in a cycle of uncertainty. Rebellions rose, faded, and returned again. Alliances shifted constantly. Men who stood beside the crown one month might oppose it the next. Noble families calculated every opportunity. Military commanders weighed loyalty against personal advantage. Even ordinary citizens found it difficult to know whom to trust. The Fronde was not a single rebellion with one clear purpose. Instead, it resembled many overlapping struggles unfolding at the same time. Some participants wanted limits placed upon royal authority. Others hoped to recover privileges they believed had been taken away. A few simply saw chaos as an opportunity to increase their own influence. For families living in villages and towns, these political arguments often meant something much simpler. Higher taxes. Food shortages. Interrupted trade. The constant uncertainty that always follows prolonged conflict. Merchants worried whether roads remained safe enough for wagons carrying cloth, wine, grain, or salt. Farmers wondered if soldiers might march through their fields before harvest. Parents prayed their children would avoid disease as overcrowded towns struggled with poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge. These were not glamorous years. Yet they shaped the future of France just as much as any famous battle. Meanwhile, Cardinal Mazarin continued guiding the young king through this dangerous landscape. He was frequently criticized, particularly because he had been born in Italy rather than France. Rumors spread through pamphlets and conversations in crowded marketplaces. Some accused him of greed. Others claimed he held too much influence over the queen. Political criticism often grows louder during difficult times. Mazarin understood this well. Instead of reacting emotionally, he relied upon patience. Negotiation became one of his greatest strengths. When force became necessary, he used it carefully. When compromise offered better results, he accepted compromise. The young Louis watched everything. History classrooms sometimes present kings as if they suddenly became wise upon reaching adulthood. Reality is usually quieter than that. Leadership develops through observation long before it becomes visible. Louis studied conversations between experienced ministers. He learned when silence could be more powerful than argument. He watched powerful men flatter one another while secretly competing for influence. He discovered that appearances often concealed very different intentions. These lessons would remain with him throughout his extraordinary reign. Eventually, after years of conflict, royal authority slowly recovered. One rebellion after another lost momentum. Some leaders accepted negotiations. Others were defeated militarily. Gradually, the Fronde came to an end. France had survived. But survival had come at a cost. Many regions remained financially exhausted. Trust between the monarchy and sections of the nobility had been badly damaged. The government still faced enormous debts accumulated during years of warfare. Yet something else had changed as well. The monarchy emerged with a clearer understanding of its enemies. And Louis emerged with a clearer understanding of power. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to step back and consider what Europe itself looked like during these years. The continent was still recovering from one of the most devastating conflicts in its history, the 30 Years' War. Beginning in 1618, this enormous struggle had drawn dozens of rulers, kingdoms, religious factions, and armies into conflict. Entire regions were devastated. Cities suffered repeated occupations. Disease spread alongside marching soldiers. Harvests failed. Civilian populations endured hardships almost impossible to imagine today. Although France had entered the war later than some other powers, it had played a decisive role in weakening the Habsburg dynasties that ruled both Spain and large parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Victory brought prestige. But victory also brought bills. Wars are expensive. Armies require wages, horses, weapons, food, uniforms, engineers, doctors, carts, bridges, fortifications, and endless supplies. Even successful campaigns leave governments searching for money long after celebrations have ended. France now stood among Europe's leading powers. Maintaining that position would demand careful leadership. In 1651, Louis was officially declared old enough to rule. He was still only a teenager. Legally, the regency had ended. In practice, Cardinal Mazarin remained the kingdom's dominant political figure. Some young rulers might have resented this arrangement. Louis appears instead to have treated these remaining years as an education. He continued improving his riding, hunting, dancing, military studies, and knowledge of government. Court ceremonies trained him to move with confidence before large audiences. Every gesture carried meaning. Standing, walking, speaking, receiving ambassadors, nothing was considered too small to matter. Royal authority depended partly upon appearance. If subjects believed their king looked confident, orderly, and disciplined, confidence itself became a political tool. This may seem unusual today. But 17th-century Europe understood symbolism differently. Clothing, architecture, ceremonies, paintings, and public rituals communicated political messages just as speeches do in the modern world. Louis absorbed this lesson completely. For a while, however, he remained in Mazarin's shadow. Then came another turning point. In March 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. Many experienced officials expected that the young king would immediately appoint another powerful chief minister. After all, France had relied upon great advisors for decades. Instead, Louis surprised everyone. He announced that from that day forward, he would govern personally. No new chief minister would stand between the king and the affairs of state. The decision seemed simple. History would remember it as revolutionary. Louis was only 22 years old. Some courtiers quietly doubted him. Others assumed the arrangement could not last. Yet day after day, week after week, month after month, the king immersed himself in government. He read reports carefully. He questioned ministers directly. He demanded detailed information about finance, diplomacy, military planning, taxation, trade, agriculture, and justice. He worked astonishingly long hours. Behind the image of endless luxury stood remarkable discipline. The glamorous paintings often show Louis wearing magnificent robes decorated with embroidered gold, carrying symbols of royal authority beneath brilliant chandeliers. Those images are not entirely false. But they reveal only part of the man. The reality also included stacks of official documents, lengthy council meetings, diplomatic correspondence arriving from every corner of Europe, financial records needing review, and difficult decisions with no perfect solutions. History has a habit of turning rulers into statues. Living rulers are far more complicated. Louis certainly enjoyed ceremony. He appreciated magnificent clothing. He valued beauty, music, architecture, and artistic achievement. Yet he also believed deeply that ruling required constant work. His famous statement, often summarized as "I am the state," has become one of history's best-known quotations. Historians continue debating whether he ever spoke those exact words. The surviving evidence is uncertain. What seems beyond doubt is something slightly different. Louis genuinely believed that the stability of France depended upon the strength of its monarchy. His own experiences during the Fronde convinced him that divided authority invited chaos. To him, centralized government was not simply ambition. It was protection. Protection against rebellion. Protection against civil war. Protection against weakness. Whether history ultimately agrees with that belief is another question. But understanding his reasoning helps us understand the man himself. Around him gathered an extraordinary collection of ministers. Jean-Baptiste Colbert became one of the kingdom's most influential administrators. Intelligent, energetic, and remarkably hard-working, Colbert focused on strengthening France's economy. Factories received encouragement. Roads improved. Canals expanded transportation. Trade increased. French industries producing luxury goods, including silk, lace, mirrors, tapestries, and furniture, received royal support. Colbert hoped France could produce expensive goods domestically instead of purchasing them from foreign rivals. Economic policy became another battlefield. Not one fought with cannons, but with workshops, ships, markets, taxes, and skilled craftsmen. At the same time, military reforms continued under talented commanders and administrators. Soldiers received more standardized organization. Fortifications improved under brilliant military engineers like Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, whose star-shaped forts would become famous throughout Europe. France slowly transformed itself into one of the continent's most organized states. But beneath these impressive achievements, tensions quietly remained. The kingdom's prosperity was uneven. Large cities displayed growing wealth. Country villages often did not. Many peasants still struggled beneath heavy taxes. Harvest failures continued bringing hardship. The distance separating wealthy nobles from ordinary laborers remained enormous. For a while, these differences stayed hidden beneath growing national confidence. Yet history rarely allows such differences to disappear forever. Still, from the perspective of foreign ambassadors visiting France during these years, the kingdom appeared increasingly powerful. Its armies expanded. Its economy strengthened. Its administration became more efficient. Its young king projected confidence unlike any ruler Europe had seen in generations. Something larger was beginning to emerge. Not merely a successful government, but an entirely new image of monarchy itself. Louis no longer wished to be simply another European king. He intended to become the standard by which kingship would be measured. The greatest expression of that vision had not yet risen from the countryside west of Paris. At the moment, Versailles remained little more than a modest hunting lodge surrounded by woods, marshes, and quiet fields where birds crossed open skies and deer wandered among the trees. Few visitors could have guessed that this peaceful landscape would soon become the most famous royal palace in Europe. Or that thousands of workers would reshape the land itself in service of one man's extraordinary vision. The age of the Sun King was only beginning. And the brightest light was still waiting to rise. The quiet hunting lodge at Versailles did not look like the future center of Europe. If you had wandered through the countryside west of Paris in the early years of Louis XIV's reign, you would have found woods filled with birdsong, narrow paths softened by fallen leaves, small ponds reflecting passing clouds, and a modest royal residence built mainly for hunting trips. The air smelled of damp earth after rain, wild grass, and fresh timber. It was peaceful. Almost ordinary. Nothing about the place suggested that kings, queens, ambassadors, generals, artists, musicians, philosophers, and noble families from across Europe would one day measure their own courts against it. Yet Louis saw something that others did not. He had learned during the Fronde that Paris could become dangerous. The capital was crowded, politically unpredictable, and filled with powerful institutions that did not always share the king's ambitions. Versailles offered something different. Distance. Space. Control. At first, the changes were modest. Builders repaired and expanded the old lodge. Gardens were redesigned. New paths appeared. Additional rooms welcomed a growing court. But each project led naturally to another. Before long, architects, engineers, gardeners, sculptors, painters, and craftsmen were working together on a scale Europe had rarely witnessed. The transformation became one of the greatest building projects of the 17th century. Thousands of laborers arrived. Stonecutters shaped enormous blocks of limestone. Carpenters raised vast wooden frameworks. Blacksmiths forged iron gates and decorative railings. Gardeners planted endless rows of carefully chosen trees. Engineers redirected water through complicated systems designed to feed magnificent fountains. From sunrise until evening, the sound of hammers echoed across the construction site. Wagons rolled through muddy roads carrying marble, timber, glass, and supplies. Horses strained beneath heavy loads. Clouds of dust drifted into the air as walls slowly climbed higher. Versailles was not simply becoming larger. It was becoming a statement. Louis understood something surprisingly modern about power. People do not only believe what they are told. They also believe what they see. When foreign ambassadors approached Versailles, they encountered endless gardens stretching toward the horizon. Carefully trimmed hedges formed geometric patterns almost too perfect to seem natural. Statues from classical mythology stood beside fountains that glittered beneath sunlight. Long canals reflected the sky like polished mirrors. Every tree appeared placed with deliberate intention. Nature itself seemed disciplined. That mattered. The palace suggested that if the king could organize gardens on such an immense scale, perhaps he could organize an entire kingdom as well. Inside, beauty surrounded visitors from every direction. Ceilings displayed magnificent paintings celebrating royal victories and classical heroes. Marble floors reflected candlelight during evening gatherings. Rich fabrics covered walls. Crystal chandeliers illuminated grand rooms where musicians performed and conversations unfolded in whispers beneath painted ceilings. Years later, the Hall of Mirrors would become the palace's most famous room. Its long rows of mirrors reflected both candlelight and daylight until the space seemed almost endless. At a time when large mirrors were extraordinarily expensive, displaying so many together announced France's growing wealth and craftsmanship. Guests entering the hall often paused without realizing it. Wonder has a way of slowing people down. But Versailles was never intended to be merely beautiful. It was designed to shape behavior. To understand why, we need to look beyond the architecture and into the daily life of the royal court. For generations, powerful French nobles had governed their own lands with considerable independence. Many possessed ancient family histories stretching back centuries. They commanded local loyalty, owned impressive castles, and often maintained private military traditions. Louis wanted something different. Rather than allowing great nobles to remain distant in their provinces, he encouraged, and sometimes quietly pressured, them to spend long periods living at Versailles. At first glance, this seemed like an honor. Many accepted gladly. Life at court offered prestige, entertainment, influence, and proximity to the king. Yet there was another side to the arrangement. While nobles attended elaborate ceremonies, competed for invitations, discussed fashion, sponsored artists, and sought royal favor, they spent less time strengthening independent power bases far from the capital. Versailles became a carefully managed world where ambition flowed toward one person: the king. Every morning followed an intricate routine. The king's awakening itself became a formal ceremony known as the lever. Selected courtiers entered according to strict rules of rank. Some held the privilege of handing the king his shirt. Others presented gloves or ceremonial garments. Each role, no matter how small, carried enormous social importance. To modern observers, such rituals may seem almost unbelievable. Why would powerful nobles compete for the chance to help someone dress? Because access meant influence. Influence meant opportunity. Opportunity could bring titles, offices, wealth, military commands, or favorable decisions affecting entire families. At Versailles, even small moments became political currency. The evening routine followed similar patterns. Meals, walks through the gardens, theatrical performances, hunting expeditions, concerts, religious ceremonies, diplomatic receptions, and formal celebrations all reinforced the same message. Everything revolved around the king. This carefully choreographed world gave Louis remarkable control over the aristocracy. Yet beyond the palace walls, ordinary life looked very different. In villages across France, farmers still rose before dawn. Their days depended upon weather more than politics. Rain at the wrong time could ruin crops. An early frost threatened vineyards. A poor harvest meant rising bread prices. Families baked simple loaves, tended livestock, repaired fences, and prayed for favorable seasons. Children helped gather firewood before winter. Women carried water from wells. Blacksmiths repaired farming tools worn down by constant use. Travelers stopping at roadside inns exchanged news from distant regions. Sometimes those conversations included stories about Versailles. People spoke of endless fountains, golden decorations, magnificent feasts, glittering clothing embroidered with silver and gold thread. Many stories grew larger with every retelling. Some listeners admired their king's splendor. Others quietly wondered how much such magnificence cost. That question would become increasingly important. Still, France under Louis experienced remarkable cultural growth. The king believed that artistic greatness strengthened national prestige. He became an enthusiastic patron of painters, sculptors, architects, composers, playwrights, and scholars. Among them stood one remarkable writer: Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known by his stage name, Molière. Molière's comedies entertained audiences while gently exposing human vanity, hypocrisy, greed, and foolishness. His plays made people laugh, but they also encouraged reflection. Louis admired his work. Royal support allowed Molière to continue creating performances that remain famous centuries later. Music flourished as well. The composer Jean-Baptiste Lully transformed French opera and court music. Grand performances combined orchestras, singers, dancers, elaborate costumes, and spectacular stage machinery. Visitors to Versailles experienced not merely politics. They experienced carefully orchestrated culture. Art itself became part of government. Painters celebrated royal achievements. Architects expressed order through design. Gardeners shaped landscapes into symbols of harmony. Even fireworks displayed during festivals communicated royal magnificence. Europe noticed. Foreign rulers sent ambassadors not only to negotiate treaties but also to study French fashions, architecture, etiquette, military organization, and administration. French gradually became the preferred language of diplomacy among many European courts. Clothing styles spread across borders. Furniture designs inspired craftsmen abroad. Royal ceremonies influenced distant monarchies. The cultural influence of France reached far beyond its frontiers. For a time, it seemed that Louis had achieved something extraordinary. Military strength. Economic growth. Administrative efficiency. Artistic brilliance. International prestige. The pieces appeared to fit together almost perfectly. But history rarely remains balanced for long. Beneath the polished floors of Versailles, new pressures quietly gathered. The palace required enormous resources. Maintaining gardens, fountains, servants, guards, musicians, kitchens, horses, and buildings demanded constant expenditure. Meanwhile, France's growing ambitions abroad would soon require even greater sacrifices. Louis believed that a strong kingdom should possess secure frontiers. He also believed that France deserved a leading position within Europe. Those convictions would draw the kingdom into a series of wars lasting much of his reign. At first, success seemed almost effortless. France possessed one of Europe's finest armies. Talented commanders led disciplined soldiers supported by improved logistics and modern fortifications. Victories came. Territories expanded. Foreign governments watched with growing concern. Because every French success altered the balance of power. Neighboring kingdoms that once competed with one another began discovering a shared interest. Containing France. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Louis did not see himself as a reckless conqueror. In his own mind, many campaigns defended legitimate claims or strengthened national security. His rivals saw matters differently. To them, France appeared increasingly dominant. Alliances slowly formed. Old enemies found common cause. Diplomats worked late into the night drafting agreements intended to prevent any single kingdom from becoming too powerful. Europe was beginning to unite, not through friendship, but through shared anxiety. Inside Versailles, however, daily life continued with remarkable elegance. Candles illuminated evening concerts. Perfume drifted through richly decorated halls. Silk gowns rustled softly across polished floors. Gentle conversation mixed with distant music echoing beneath painted ceilings. Outside, gardeners trimmed hedges with astonishing precision. Fountains rose toward the sky. The palace seemed almost timeless. Yet beyond those carefully designed gardens, armies were marching. Treasuries were straining. And the greatest challenges of Louis XIV's reign were still waiting beyond the horizon. The Sun King stood at the height of his glory. But even the brightest afternoon slowly moves toward evening. At the height of Louis XIV's reign, it was easy to believe that the brilliance of Versailles would last forever. The palace shimmered beneath the sunlight as if it had always existed. The fountains rose in graceful arcs. Courtiers hurried through endless galleries dressed in silk and velvet. Diplomats from distant kingdoms bowed before the French king, carefully choosing every word. Musicians filled grand halls with elegant melodies while candles reflected endlessly across the hall of mirrors. To visitors, France appeared almost unstoppable. But history has a quiet habit of reminding even the greatest empires that no season lasts forever. The very success Louis had worked so hard to build also created new dangers. Other European rulers watched France with growing concern. They admired its culture, copied its fashions, and studied its military organization. Yet admiration slowly turned into caution. If France became too powerful, what would happen to everyone else? This question shaped the next chapter of Louis's life. Across Europe, kingdoms that had once distrusted one another began forming alliances. England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and other powers increasingly found themselves united by a single goal: preventing France from dominating the continent. Louis had spent years strengthening his kingdom. Now he faced a Europe determined to slow him down. The wars that followed would stretch across decades. Unlike the swift victories of earlier campaigns, these conflicts became long, exhausting struggles. Armies marched across muddy roads through rain and bitter winter snow. Supply wagons struggled to keep pace. Horses weakened after weeks of travel. Soldiers often suffered more from hunger, disease, and freezing weather than from combat itself. For ordinary people, war rarely looked heroic. It looked like empty fields, abandoned farms, rising prices, and families waiting for loved ones who might never return. In villages across France, mothers worried as sons left to join the army. Farmers wondered whether another harvest would be taken to feed soldiers. Merchants hesitated before sending expensive goods along roads where armies had recently passed. Life continued, but it became more difficult. Inside Versailles, ceremonies still took place. The king continued receiving ambassadors, attending mass, reviewing reports, and meeting with ministers. Yet behind the polished routines, financial pressure steadily increased. Wars consumed astonishing amounts of money. Weapons needed replacing. Fortresses required maintenance. Ships demanded repairs. Soldiers expected wages. Every campaign placed another burden upon the royal treasury. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, whose careful management had helped strengthen France's finances, died in 1683. His absence left a noticeable gap within the administration. Although capable officials remained, replacing such an experienced minister was never easy. Around the same time, another deeply personal loss affected the king. Queen Maria Theresa, Louis's wife, died in 1683. Their marriage had been arranged largely for political reasons, as many royal marriages were. Though not always emotionally close in the way modern readers might imagine, they had shared decades together and raised children, while also enduring the heartbreak of losing several of them in infancy or childhood. Royal families were not protected from grief. Behind crowns and ceremonies stood parents who mourned. Louis himself experienced repeated personal losses throughout his long life. Brothers, sisters-in-law, children, grandchildren, trusted ministers, military commanders, lifelong friends, many died before him. The older he became, the quieter Versailles sometimes felt. One generation slowly disappeared. Another replaced it. The palace remained magnificent, but the familiar faces around the king changed year after year. And beneath all of this, something much larger was beginning to move. Europe itself was changing. Trade expanded across oceans. Scientific discoveries challenged older ways of understanding the world. Ideas about government, religion, and society slowly evolved. Although these changes unfolded gradually, they hinted that the world Louis had inherited would not remain unchanged forever. One of the most debated decisions of his reign came in 1685, when Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes. Nearly a century earlier, that edict had granted important protections to French Protestants, known as Huguenots. By revoking it, Louis hoped to strengthen religious unity within his kingdom. From his perspective, one king should rule over one united faith. The reality proved more complicated. Many Protestants chose to leave France rather than convert. Skilled craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, scholars, and artisans settled in other European countries, taking their talents with them. Historians continue discussing the long-term effects of this decision. Some argue it weakened parts of the French economy by encouraging talented people to emigrate. Others emphasize the broader political and religious consequences across Europe. What seems certain is that the decision reshaped countless individual lives. Families packed belongings. Children left the towns where they had been born. Journeys began toward uncertain futures. History often remembers royal decrees. The people who quietly carried them out are easier to forget. As the years passed, Louis himself changed. The energetic young ruler who had danced in court ballets gradually became an aging monarch carrying the weight of nearly half a century on the throne. His dark hair turned gray. His face grew lined. Illness visited more frequently. Yet he continued working. Foreign ambassadors frequently remarked upon his discipline. Even in old age, he maintained remarkably regular routines. Duty had become habit. Then came one of the greatest international conflicts of his reign, the War of the Spanish Succession. When the childless King Charles II of Spain died in 1700, the question of who should inherit the enormous Spanish Empire threatened to upset the balance of power across Europe. Louis supported his grandson, Philip of Anjou. Other European rulers feared that France and Spain might eventually unite under one royal family, creating a superpower unlike anything the continent had ever seen. War became almost unavoidable. For more than a decade, Europe was engulfed in conflict. Great battles were fought. Famous commanders emerged. Cities endured sieges. Entire regions suffered repeated invasions. The human cost was immense. Although France remained powerful, victory became increasingly difficult. Several major defeats shocked a kingdom accustomed to military success. Taxes rose again. Food shortages combined with severe winters. The terrible winter of 1709 brought extraordinary hardship. Rivers froze. Crops failed. Bread became scarce in many areas. Ordinary families struggled simply to survive. Even Versailles could not escape awareness of the suffering beyond its gates. The palace still glittered. France did not. By now, Louis had outlived nearly everyone he had once known. His eldest son died. Then his grandson. Then his great-grandson. The line of succession narrowed dramatically. The future of the Bourbon dynasty rested upon a small child, another Louis, who would eventually become Louis XV. History was repeating itself in unexpected ways. Once again, an aging king looked toward a young heir. Once again, uncertainty surrounded the future. After 72 years on the throne, the longest confirmed reign of any major European monarch, Louis XIV died on September 1, 1715. He was 76 years old. Almost no one living in France could remember a time before his reign. Entire generations had been born, lived, and grown old under the same king. The kingdom paused. Church bells rang. Black cloth covered familiar decorations. Courtiers who had spent their entire adult lives serving one monarch suddenly found themselves entering a different age. According to accounts from the time, Louis accepted death with remarkable calm. He is said to have advised his young successor not to imitate his love of war and to seek peace whenever possible. Whether every word attributed to him is perfectly accurate remains uncertain. But the advice reflects lessons that decades of triumph and hardship might well have taught. So what, then, was the true legacy of the Sun King? The answer depends upon where we choose to look. If we stand inside Versailles, we see astonishing artistic achievement. Architecture, painting, sculpture, music, landscape design, and craftsmanship combine to create one of humanity's greatest royal residences. Even today, millions of visitors walk through its galleries, gazing upward at painted ceilings and across gardens that still reflect Louis's extraordinary ambition. If we study politics, we find a ruler who strengthened the French monarchy more than almost any king before him. He centralized authority, improved administration, and transformed the image of kingship throughout Europe. If we examine culture, his influence becomes even broader. French language, fashion, literature, etiquette, architecture, and artistic style spread across the continent. Other monarchs built their own palaces inspired by Versailles. Courts from Russia to Spain borrowed elements of the French model. Yet history also remembers the costs. Long wars exhausted resources. Heavy taxation burdened ordinary people. Religious intolerance divided communities. Magnificent achievements often stood beside profound human suffering. Louis XIV was not simply a hero. He was not simply a villain. He was a deeply human ruler living within an age of extraordinary ambition, certainty, fear, brilliance, and contradiction. History has a habit of flattening people into symbols. The Sun King became one of the brightest symbols of monarchy. But beneath that symbol lived a boy frightened by rebellion, a hard-working administrator buried beneath endless documents, a patron of extraordinary artists, a determined ruler convinced that order prevented chaos, an aging grandfather mourning lost heirs, and finally an old man whose reign had become almost as vast as the century itself. Today, when sunlight reflects from the windows of Versailles, visitors often pause in quiet admiration. They see beauty. They see power. But if they listen carefully, they may also hear echoes of countless forgotten lives, the gardeners who shaped the grounds, the craftsmen who polished mirrors, the soldiers who marched across Europe, the farmers who harvested grain, the musicians who filled royal evenings with sound, and the families whose ordinary days unfolded beneath the long shadow of an extraordinary king. Perhaps that is the most lasting lesson of Louis XIV's story. History is never made by famous names alone. It is built, day by day, by millions of ordinary people whose lives quietly support the great events recorded in books. And the story of the Sun King reminds us that even the brightest light casts a shadow, while every shadow hints at a light beyond it. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through 17th-century France. If you're still awake, I hope these hours among palaces, villages, battlefields, and gardens have offered both gentle company and a new way of seeing one of history's most remarkable rulers. There will always be another forgotten road through the past waiting for us, another empire to explore, another life to understand. But for tonight, let the candles fade, let the palace fall silent once more, and let the echoes of history slowly give way to the peaceful stillness of the night. There is one final part of Louis XIV's story that is easy to overlook. When most people think of the Sun King, they imagine a single man standing at the center of an age of splendor. They picture the hall of mirrors glowing with candlelight, nobles dressed in embroidered silk, fountains rising beneath clear blue skies, and a monarch whose authority seemed almost limitless. Yet no reign, however magnificent, truly ends when the ruler dies. Its consequences continue quietly, sometimes for generations. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in the France Louis left behind. When Louis XIV died in September of 1715, the kingdom entered an unfamiliar silence. For 72 years, nearly every important decision had, in one way or another, led back to him. Children had become grandparents without ever knowing another king. Ministers had built entire careers serving the same monarch. Artists had created masterpieces under his patronage. Soldiers had marched into countless campaigns carrying his banners. Suddenly, the center of that world was gone. The new king, Louis XV, was only 5 years old. Once again, France found itself placing enormous hopes upon a child. The comparison with Louis XIV's own childhood was impossible to ignore. History rarely repeats itself exactly. But it often echoes. The government now faced a complicated inheritance. France remained one of Europe's strongest kingdoms. Its administration was efficient. Its army was respected. Its culture continued to influence courts across the continent. Versailles stood as a masterpiece unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Yet beneath these remarkable achievements lay enormous financial problems. Decades of warfare had left heavy debts. Taxation remained unequal. Many privileges enjoyed by the nobility and clergy continued to place much of the financial burden upon ordinary people. These tensions would not disappear. Instead, they would quietly grow over the coming decades. Few people living in 1715 could imagine that less than 80 years later, another generation of French men and women would witness the French Revolution. The world of kings would be shaken forever. Of course, Louis XIV could not have known this future. History never grants its participants the advantage of hindsight. People live forward. Only later do historians look backward and connect events into larger patterns. Still, many historians see important connections between Louis's reign and the France that eventually experienced revolution. His centralization of power made the monarchy stronger than ever before. At the same time, it also meant that future kings would carry greater responsibility when problems emerged. When harvests failed. When debts increased. When reform became necessary. People naturally looked toward the crown. That was one of the great paradoxes of absolute monarchy. The stronger the king became, the more the kingdom expected from him. And expectations can become burdens. Yet it would be unfair to judge Louis only through events that occurred long after his death. Every historical figure deserves to be understood within the world they actually inhabited. Louis ruled during an age when monarchy was considered the natural form of government across almost all of Europe. Powerful rulers in Austria, Russia, Spain, Prussia, and many other kingdoms also worked to strengthen central authority. Louis was not unusual in wanting a powerful monarchy. What made him extraordinary was the scale on which he pursued it. His influence reached far beyond politics. European architecture changed because of Versailles. Landscape design changed because of Versailles. Court ceremony changed because of Versailles. Fashion changed because of Versailles. Diplomatic language increasingly became French. Artists, musicians, writers, architects, and craftsmen across Europe studied French styles with remarkable admiration. Even rulers who opposed France often admired French culture. Peter the Great of Russia visited Western Europe only a few years before Louis's death. Although he did not simply copy Versailles, he recognized the importance of learning from Western European states, including France. The Great Palace at Peterhof would later reflect some of these broader influences. Frederick the Great of Prussia admired aspects of French culture throughout his life. The Austrian Habsburg court borrowed elements of French etiquette. Spanish rulers continued maintaining close connections with the Bourbon dynasty established during Louis's reign. In subtle ways, the Sun King's world spread across Europe. Sometimes through diplomacy. Sometimes through admiration. Sometimes through rivalry. Even opposition can spread influence. Then there was the palace itself. Versailles never became merely a royal residence. It became an idea. An idea that architecture could communicate political authority. That gardens could symbolize order. That ceremony could reinforce government. That beauty itself could serve the state. Visitors still experience this today. They walk beneath painted ceilings. They stand before enormous windows overlooking carefully designed gardens. They admire fountains that still rise into the air after more than 3 centuries. Yet behind every polished marble floor lies another story. The story of thousands of workers whose names history rarely records. Stone masons. Gardeners. Carpenters. Metalworkers. Glassmakers. Painters. Servants. Cooks. Stable hands. Messengers. Laundry workers. Musicians. Guards. Without them, Versailles would never have existed. Great monuments often bear the names of rulers. They are built by countless ordinary hands. This may be one of history's quietest lessons. The famous depend upon the forgotten. Louis himself seemed aware, at least in part, that glory was temporary. Late in life, illness became an almost constant companion. Walking grew more difficult. Court ceremonies demanded increasing effort. Many of the brilliant young nobles who had danced before him decades earlier had already passed away. New faces filled the palace. Children became adults. Adults became old. The gardens remained carefully trimmed. The fountains continued flowing. But time moved steadily onward. There is something deeply human about that image. Even the most powerful king in Europe could not command the seasons to stop changing. He could order armies. He could commission palaces. He could negotiate treaties. He could influence the destinies of millions. But he could not prevent autumn from following summer. Perhaps that is why Louis XIV continues to fascinate people centuries later. His life contains extraordinary contrasts. Luxury alongside hardship. Confidence alongside fear. Beauty alongside suffering. Art alongside war. Control alongside uncertainty. He believed deeply in order. Yet he ruled in a world constantly shaped by unpredictability. History often encourages us to choose simple conclusions. Either someone was entirely successful, or entirely unsuccessful. Real lives rarely fit such categories. Louis XIV built one of history's greatest royal courts. He strengthened France into Europe's leading cultural power. He inspired artists whose works still move audiences today. He also led expensive wars, imposed heavy burdens upon his people, and made decisions whose consequences remain debated by historians. Both realities can exist together. And understanding both allows us to see him not as a legend, but as a human being. That, perhaps, is the greatest gift history offers. Not certainty, but perspective. It reminds us that people of the past faced difficult choices without knowing how future generations would judge them. Like us, they lived surrounded by incomplete information, competing pressures, personal hopes, private fears, and uncertain tomorrows. The difference is only that their tomorrows became our history. As the night grows quieter, imagine Versailles once more. The crowds have disappeared. The musicians have packed away their instruments. The ambassadors have returned home. The candles have burned low. Moonlight settles gently across the palace gardens. The fountains fall silent. A soft breeze moves through rows of ancient trees planted more than 300 years ago. Somewhere beyond the palace, villages sleep peacefully beneath the same stars that watched over Louis XIV himself. Empires rise. Empires change. Palaces endure. Then they become museums. Kings become names in books. Their decisions become subjects of quiet conversation centuries later. But the human stories remain. A frightened child leaving Paris in the darkness. A determined young ruler promising never to lose control again. An aging king walking slowly through the gardens he had spent a lifetime creating. And millions of ordinary people living their own quiet lives beneath the long shadow of history. Thank you for spending this evening walking through the remarkable life of Louis XIV. Whether you joined this journey from a bustling city, a quiet village, or somewhere in between, I hope the story has offered a peaceful escape into another time. There are still countless roads left to travel through history, forgotten civilizations buried beneath desert sands, ships that vanished beyond distant horizons, emperors whose greatest victories became their greatest mistakes, and ordinary people whose lives quietly shaped the world we know today. But those stories can wait for another evening. For now, let the palace doors close softly behind us. Let the last candle flicker out. Let the gardens rest beneath the stars. And as the echoes of the Sun King's world fade into the stillness of the night, may your own thoughts grow lighter, your breathing slower, and your mind drift peacefully toward sleep. Good night.